But what happened is this thing came into the space. I worked with the students from the University of East London, and over the period of 3.5 weeks of a 5-week show, we just worked with the public coming through, pulling this thing out. And what we did is we drilled holes into it, and we anchored 2-ton ratchet straps, and we anchored those to the walls, and we started to pull this thing out to the point where we could bore holes into it, put hydraulics in, and pump it out as well. So it was about getting back to pulling it out, you know, like the fiver. And people came in and watched us doing this and asked questions, and we spoke to them about what we were attempting to do. None of us trained to do it. It was just empirical thinking. Meanwhile, we had 2 cameras that were firing off a computer that was telling the cameras to photograph every 5 minutes. And one of those was a movie camera that was taking still, so we were getting a soundtrack as well. And at the end of the 3.5 weeks, when we got this aeroplane out, we'd accumulated something like 6,500 images. That's one of the images towards the end. We then pitched the aeroplane up into the air and spun it over out of camera shot, where I cut all the straps and it just crashed to the floor like a swatted gnat, and it was just buckled again and useless. And what I realised is in the 3.5 weeks we were compressing time. We were taking those 5-minute photographs. So overnight we built an enormous screen, 16 feet by 12 feet, and we edited from the 6,500, we edited down to daylight images, stretched them by 4 to make it like a 4-minute movie approximately. It was too fast otherwise. And what you had is this beautiful metamorphosis of this crushed thing opening out. So we'd taken an object, a physical thing in the world, and compressed it, pulled it back out to get a film that was about compression and time. And this was a breakthrough because it started to suggest to me a number of works subsequent to this one throughout the latter part of the 2000s, where film became an element in the sculpture, an element that witnessed process or allowed time into the sculpture. Sculpture's very good about talking about mass, but it's very difficult to talk about time, I find, with sculptures. So the film aspect helped in that way. And this is a classic example. You can see behind the buckled, glistening wreck of the aeroplane, which gave birth to this metamorphosis, this change where, you know, the thing came out. So when people came back to see the development with the aeroplane, it wasn't there. You were in darkness and you were watching this film with all those many moments of sound happening.
Oddly enough, although you're essentially a sculptor, I can see something incredibly painterly going on here as well, can't I? It's almost as if it was like a painting.
Yeah, I mean, it was a rather sort of foreboding room. I mean, it's a very beautiful space actually, but it's not. It's what I'd call a raw space. I mean, they've not thrown buckets of money at it, put in, you know, white walls and lighting, and it was cold.
Yeah.
You know, you could see your breath. It was a concrete floor. We were working in the winter, and suddenly when we put this film together and played it, it was a very beautiful. A beautiful thing. And in actual fact, our dear friend, another Richard Dormant, wrote an article about the piece. Yeah. And he just, his father had just died, and he said for him it seemed to conjure up something about life, and that things are so transitory. That, you know, the aeroplane gets crushed, and it comes out, and it's died, and then the film comes out and goes back. And it seemed to be this whole thing of movement, of a life cycle. And I hadn't seen it like that, but it was a very moving piece that he wrote, actually, about that.
Absolutely. And it's not just airplanes you're interested in, you're also interested in watercraft. This is a dramatically sliced dredger, which I remember particularly vividly because I was on the selection panel for it in 2000. It was called the North Meadow Sculpture Project.
That's right.
And it happened just next door to the dome, didn't it? The Millennium Dome. And there were quite a few artists involved, like Anthony Gormley, Tony Cragg, and yourself. Richard, where did you find that?
It was a half a year searching and talking to the right person and being sort of guided.
All your London connections again?
All my London connections. I actually found, some people must know it here, there was a very, very interesting character called Harry Pound who was down at Portsmouth, and he had like loads of submarines and ships sort of stuffed to one side of the kind of Portsmouth Bay. And he was a scrapper or breaker of ships. And I went down to talk to him, and he told me where this one was, up on the River Tees, up at Stockton. And I went up there, and I thought it was a really ugly ship. I didn't want to work with it. But in actual fact, I was fast running out of time, and I had to find something. And they're not easy things to find. I'd never gone looking for a ship before, and there were reasons why I wanted to find the ship, but as I say, I came across the Arco Trent, and it was very, very cheap, actually. And the deal was done in a car park over the phone. And I knew it was going to go for auction, and there was one other bidder who I would have to fight. So I got in contact with that guy and said, listen, I'll buy it and I'll give it to you, but I want this bit. And that was the deal. I bought it in the auction. We then put it into a dry dock on the River Tees, and he broke the ship up. And this is 1/8 of a sand dredger that ran on the German-French coast and brought sand back to Portsmouth.
Massive.
240 feet long.
Yeah.
And this is a 29-foot section. And as you said, 25 artists from around Great Britain were invited to put sculptures in the North Meadow Sculpture Park.
Yeah.
But myself and Anthony decided to work out on the foreshore.
He
was round the other side
yeah.
using one of the pilings from an old jetty. And, and I, as an artist working with architecture, thought, well, what kind of statement can I make? And I thought, well, if I want to work with architecture, what about maritime architecture? If you can, in some way, I started to get interested in that little strip of brass that goes across the park pathway up at the observatory in Greenwich Park, and what it represents. It's rather like walking over Tower Bridge and seeing tourists with either leg on the balusters, and they love to stand over that gap, and it's what that void means to them. And it's the same with the brass strip, which is the 0 longitude. I think it's longitude. And people stand either side of that. It's a piece of brass in the tarmac, but it means so much. So I started thinking, again, quite formally, I started thinking about if you can slice a district with a brass line and talk about 0 latitude, longitude, how can you announce that by putting a sliced object onto it? What moment of something can say something much greater? Rather like the Millennium moment itself, what that moment was about X thousand years, thousand years. So what I wanted to do was find an object, and the ship was the best way of doing it. However, it ended up being more of a chunk than a slice, and it was rather compromised. It wasn't exactly on the GMT line. It was slightly downriver from there. The reason being is we weren't given permission to pile. This is actually piled into the river.
Oh, yeah.
It's anchored in.
Yeah.
And for that reason, we would possibly create disruption to the Blackwood Tunnel.
Oh, right.
So we were asked to move a couple of yards down.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of very formal ideas. And the idea also of like slicing it was rather like lots of parcels of space that make up the ship. It's a skin of steel and a skeleton, and it holds this thing together. Rather like the Millennium Dome itself. It's a skin and a set of skeleton legs, etc., that hold up this thing. So there was a comparison being made. But the real reason was that in my detective work that I do to each idea, there was this notion that in 1936, at the coronation of King George, people were invited to London to witness, the celebrations, and they placed seats all around the peninsula at Blackwall, so that people could come and watch ships coming back from our Commonwealth, going out to our Commonwealth, and the wealth that it would take or bring back. You do that today, you won't see a ship. There's no industry there. And we have Greenwich. It has this, this historic blaze of history to the Navy, but it has no doffing of the cap to the merchant seaman or the river worker. So in a way, I saw this as a kind of a doffing of the cap to the lost industries on the river. And so my original idea, and this is where artists have problems, I wanted it to actually rust into the river, to sort of weep its way back into the water as a lament to this lost industry. But you say that to an organiser and it'll ring alarm bells, mess, rubbish, rust, what? So you've pollution. So fortuitously, I ignored that moment And surprisingly for me, at the end of the exhibition, obviously 1 year only, in 2001, because we were sort of, I say poorly paid, we weren't paid a fee, as it were, very, very small fee, but we were told we could keep our own work. So it was handed back to me, and the people at the Dome said, what am I going to do with it? And I said, well, it'll either go back up north, if you want to send it back for me, as the contract says, or I shall get a contract to keep it here.
Yeah.
So I went and saw the Port of London Authority and bought a in perpetuity licence, and it happens to still be here today. I've been very lax on the maintenance, but it's available for people to go and look at. They're not allowed on board.
So they can all go and see it, Richard?
They could go and see it. As I say, it needs a paint job. I've been a bit slack in the last 2 years on that. But we have, until quite recently, opened every year for open house, which I think is due, or has just passed, due this weekend. Yeah. We're not open this time round because, as I say, we're due for a refit. But people would come aboard, and I'd put an exhibition on of work and books and stuff like that. So it's had a kind of a public use. And I also use it as my drawing and maquette studio. So the next couple of images just show you the way in which it's got this kind of versatility, because it's still there talking about this lost industry. It's there talking about the section that's sitting very close to the divide of the district. And all the other things about its association to the Millennium Dome itself. And
can I ask you
the
also?
drawing space.
Yeah, can I ask you also about the melancholy aspect of it? Because it is a sliced structure. It is something which you could call damaged. It is almost like a kind of survivor, isn't it?
Yeah.
Of something long since passed.
It's the last remnant.
But it's kind of defiant as well, isn't it? It's sort of obstinate, and it's trying to be resilient. And there's a lot going on emotionally here, isn't there, with this piece?
Yeah, I think actually what's always enjoyable is if you can calculate a breakthrough whilst working on something. And whilst working on this piece, I realised suddenly, I'm always talking about, fundamentally being a classical formalist and responding to sight. And I think what's interesting with this particular example, it's the first example where I think I'm responding to context. The open, abandoned sweep of the river. Yeah. That vista, that open part of London that's sort of forlorn and lost. Now it's not. It's changed a hell of a lot in the 11 years it's been there. Yeah. Or 12 years it's been there. Yeah. In actual fact, they're going to be building a 25, 30-storey hotel, sort of about 50 yards from this, starting next March.
Inevitably.
So it is in, it's in a sort of the shadow of development.
How funny.
But it is this, as I say, it's this last remaining remnant that talks about a lost industry, and is sort of triumphantly still trying to flag it.